Very good to see so many people here. It's a day of a rail strike, so welcome Londoners. But it's been a fantastic turnout and it's going to be a really great event. So I'm John Agar, I am co-head of the Department of Science and Technology Studies. In that sense I'm Jack's boss. And it's my job to do quite a simple thing, and that is just to say welcome to the inaugural lecture of Prof Stilgoe. I'm going to pass on to his friend and occasional colleague James Wilson from our sister department, STEEP, at UCL, who knows Jack so well, he's ideally placed to introduce him in more detail. So I'm not going to say much more, apart from it's really good to see you all. Inaugural lectures, if you don't know what they are, when you become a professor, you get one chance to talk to a big crowd and to reflect on, partly on your own research, but also point forward and give us some exciting glimpses into current and future research. And I guarantee, I've seen little hints and see little clips. I think you're in for an absolute treat this evening, because Prof Stilgoe's research is extremely exciting, very cutting edge, and you're going to enjoy it. So welcome again. Welcome from STS, welcome to UCL. I'm going to pass you over now to James Wilson, who is going to say a little bit more about Jack, and then we'll be into Jack's inaugural lecture.
Great. Thank you, John, very much, and it's a real pleasure to be here. Thank you, Jack, for the invitation to participate in this. It's lovely. It's a great occasion and wonderful to be able to share it with Jack and with all of you. As John says, it's great that you've made it here despite the train strikes, and also, of course, under the shadow of war. We're now in day 2 of the government's war on woke in science, which was unleashed yesterday at the Tory Party conference by Michelle Donnelly, who moved her new Department for Science, Innovation and Technology into full combat mode in order to safeguard scientific research from the steady creep of political correctness. Overnight reports from the front line suggest only modest territorial gains. But we're now awaiting a full bombardment. Richard Dawkins is being moved into position as we speak. At a time like this, there's probably nowhere more dangerous to be than at an STS lecture. It's the equivalent of having a picnic on the edge of a Mariupol munitions dump. So I salute your bravery, and also that of our principal combatant in this afternoon's inaugural, my good friend Prof Stilgoe. Jack, of course, is far too savvy to be swept up in any war on woke in science. He'd perhaps be a conscientious objector, or more likely a grizzled foreign correspondent, donning his hard hat and diving into thick things in order to cast a wry, informed eye on the foibles and failures of both sides, the Clive Myrill of STS. It's been my pleasure to know Jack and to work with him on and off now for almost 20 years, which makes us both feel old. We first met straight off Jack's PhD, on the politics of mobile phone masts, and at that time Jack joined the then nascent science policy team that we were setting up at the think tank Demos, which for the younger members of the audience was a think tank still around now, but then at the peak of its influence on New Labour's policy agenda. Jack took to the mysterious and at times mercurial world of wonkery like a duck to water, and within a couple of weeks it was evidently clear that he'd teach me far more than I could ever teach him. He's always been one of the most creative, fun and thought-provoking colleagues to work with, and I was delighted when in 2009 he joined me in decamping from Demos to our new base at the Royal Society, where we did our best to inject a bit of critical social science into the bloodstream of our National Academy. From there he moved, of course, back to UCL in 2012, where he's been based since. He's a hugely valued member of the STS department and a contributor to the UCL community and the wider research community in all sorts of ways. I won't go through everything Jack has done, written and said over that time, but suffice to say, his work has spanned mobile phones, nanotechnologies, geoengineering, the theory and practice of responsible innovation, and most recently, the work he's been doing on AI and autonomous systems, which he's going to speak to us about now. And through all of that work, through all of those projects, and a fantastically rich and growing body of work, to which I'm sure there's much great stuff to be added in the years ahead. 3 themes stand out for me. First, Jack's admirable, some might say stubborn refusal to swallow the latest tech hype, and instead his insistence, time and again, that we return and focus our attention on fundamental political questions of power, ownership, control, and democratic accountability. Second, his patience and persistence in making that STS case afresh in different socio-technical contexts, to different audiences, scientific, technological, and political, while at the same time injecting those arguments with a freshness and urgency that demands attention. Finally, his commitment to STS and to social science more broadly as a public intellectual project. And it needs to be restated, that commitment, at times like these. Through his podcast, through his journalism, the Guardian blog that we worked on together for a number of years, his advocacy, as well as his research, and of course his teaching here, his inspiring the next generation of students and scholars. I think Jack plays a hugely important part in the ecosystem of STS and science policy and indeed social science in the UK. So for all of this and more, Jack, thank you from me, from all of us. We very much look forward to hearing what you're going to say now and to your continued great work here at UCL. Thank you.
I wasn't nervous until I realised not only what an inaugural lecture is supposed to do, but also what I'm supposed to have been doing all this last 20 years or so. That's very nice of you. Thank you, James, thank you, John. Thank you all for coming. It's so nice to be in a nice full lecture theatre again. Thank you to UCL for being my home now for more than a decade, and for now making me a professor, which feels very grown up indeed. And tradition dictates that an inaugural lecture should be a little bit autobiographical, a little bit pedagogical. So I'm going to try a few things today. Some of you will know that I come from a family who trade in the show business. I can hear the anticipation that no, I'm not going to do any of that, but I will be dropping in occasional musical theatre references as appropriate among my citations. You'll also notice I've avoided the tradition of wearing full academic drag, despite encouragement from some colleagues. I thought that was probably a showbiz step too far. I don't know where we are with that tradition these days. I'm also going to try to, as far as possible, stick to a script. What I normally do at lectures is sort of bounce around and bust, and I figured that this was probably too important for that. Since coming to UCL, I've realised that you're supposed to, as an academic, plough a sort of narrow but deep furrow. And I've also come to realise over the decade that I'm just not very good at that. I'm not very good at depth. So I tend to sort of follow around whatever the latest fad is and wonder why it's a fad. So, like everybody else everywhere, I've spent the last year thinking about artificial intelligence. I'm now part of a... Oh, James, I think your microphone's still on. Don't whisper anything embarrassing. So I'm now part of a 5-year research program, that calls itself Responsible AI. We launched this summer. And in the same week that we launched our 5-year program, we were told that the world would end in 2. A chance to get to our halfway mark. I'm really interested in this sort of hype, in this sort of scare story. And one of the things I'm going to try and persuade you of is that the hype and the scare story are part of the same thing. A lot of this sort of new attention to artificial intelligence was prompted by this thing, which most of you will have seen. This is ChatGPT. ChatGPT, which we've all had a go with. ChatGPT was launched in November last year. It is a generative AI system that uses a large language model to do something that on the face of it is quite simple, which is to predict what the next word should be based on the language that it's also a very useful distraction from the substance of what I'm actually saying. The latest version of ChatGPT is trained on almost all of the available text on the internet, using huge amounts of computer power and some very clever algorithms to model language so that it's able to spit out something that looks like more of the same. And it can do you very plausible, if not necessarily good, pastiches of text in a variety of genres. Which has caused panic among those of us whose job involves churning out plausible pastiches of text and indeed asking our students to do the same sort of thing. Since this thing went public, and we should remember it was not yet a year old, there's been a lot of fanfare about it being the fastest growing app in history, and people have been scrambling to work out what it might mean for society. A lot of the excitement has been about how this is not just an AI that can do one thing really well, but that it might be a step towards something like an artificial general intelligence. Not just being really good at chess, or recommending what to watch on Netflix, or translating text, but being able to generalize in some unspecified way. There's a grand tradition of this story of artificial general intelligence within the history of AI, first musical theatre reference here, with the understanding that there really is no business like show business. I call this the Annie get your gun fallacy, which is anything you can do, AI can do better. And the history of these sorts of statements goes back a very long way indeed. Whether it's AI being able to play chess, or Go, or being able to drive, or to do paralegaling, or radiology, or music, or psychotherapy. AI optimists have suggested that artificial general intelligence is always just around the corner. And it seems like the more excitement there is about the technology, the more misanthropic the statements become about human beings. And many people's response to this has been a solipsistic one. It's been, we seem happy to swallow the hype and believe that AI is indeed an assault on what it means to be human. We worry about AI taking over our jobs, and these worries are supported by studies that tell us exactly when we are likely to be made redundant. And the people currently in control of the technology also tell us that we should worry about what the risks of some of them actually call godlike AI. This guy here is Sam Altman. This is Sam Altman visiting UCL back in May, talking to Azima Zahn. Sam Altman is the head of OpenAI, the makers of ChatGPT. He began his company as a not-for-profit and then switched it to a company that was rather pro-profit when he realised there might be lots of it. And he came to UCL as part of a grand tour over the summer. And this tour and his media appearances and his appearances before Congress have helped establish him as the face of the current wave of AI. Outside this talk, when Sam Altman was doing it, to an audience, incidentally, that in UCL's largest lecture theatre that sold out in less than half an hour, apparently, there was a small protest, small, quite hastily arranged protest, I think you can probably see, in which some students were warning that the dangers of AI might be existential ones. The strange thing is that Sam Altman himself would also subscribe to this view, and he worries that AI could be, as he puts it, lights out for all of us. He was one of the signatories of this admirably brief open letter. That's all of it, that one sentence is the open letter. And it seems odd to have gone from a moment of extrapolating from a chatbot that will extrude various plausible sounding bits of text to the end of the world as we know it. But the imagined apocalypse is all part of the hype. It's all part of the imaginary capabilities of artificial intelligence. And it's being used to create a sense of urgency, to bump society into accepting an inevitable logic of AI. Journalists have lapped it up. This, actually on the right, is this morning's front page of the Daily Star. The Daily Star have done quite a few front pages about what they call psycho chatbots. Time magazine, who would claim that their analysis was rather better researched. But the odd thing is that governments also are napping up some of this talk about existential risk. In a month's time, Rishi Sunak will be hosting a summit on AI safety at Bletchley Park, the former home of Alan Turing and his fellow World War II code breakers. The governments say that they are worried about two things when it comes to AI. First, they're worried about its misuse by what they refer to as bad actors. And second, they're worried about the technology running out of control if it is not, quote, aligned with our values and intentions. And by our, there, they mean the human race. They don't mean the British people or our current government or any other group. The way they talk about the technology, it's as though it's an external magical force, not a thing made by people who might have particular ends in mind. So I think we need to put people back in. I think we need to think about AI differently. I'm interested in the politics of AI, and that's what I want to discuss today. At its simplest, politics is about who gets what and how. It's about who wins and loses, and the processes for making decisions about such things. Processes that include some and exclude others, which means that we shouldn't see this as a power struggle between humans and robots. That way of looking at things gets benefits from people trying to sell us stuff. They would like us to believe the future they want is merely the next stage in society's inevitable progress. AI will, like all technologies, empower some people and disempower others. So we should be asking how it can buck the trend of past technologies which have tended to benefit people who are already privileged. This view of AI, I think, changes how we think about the opportunities and risks of new technologies, and it changes how we should view the responsibilities of companies like OpenAI and the policymakers who are currently backing them. In a bit, I will be talking about drum machines, which is where things get interesting. But before I go there, let's just talk about self-driving cars. Self-driving cars. I first got interested in self-driving cars around about 2016 because the technology seemed to be going wrong. There were some high-profile crashes in which people were killed in prototype self-driving vehicles. And then in 2018, in Phoenix, Arizona, Elaine Hertzberg had the misfortune of being the first bystander to be killed by a self-driving car. This is an informal memorial to Elaine Hertzberg, a photo taken by a colleague of mine at the at Arizona State University, who works just around the corner from where she was killed. Elaine Hertzberg was a homeless woman walking her bike across a 4-lane road at night. She was hit and killed by a self-driving Volvo that was being operated by Uber. The car was traveling at 38 miles an hour and it didn't slow down. The reason to look at this sort of thing is not a morbid one. It's that when technologies go wrong, we can learn things about the assumptions that are really shaping them, the sorts of assumptions that get hidden when things are going according to plan. The story of the self-driving vehicle that their developers like to tell is one of autonomy. They talk about autonomous vehicles, where you get a normal car, you plug out the human, you replace it with some sensors, some computing power and the data that it needs to see the world, identify other objects, predict what they're going to do next, and plan a safe route through them. By plugging in an omniscient computer, the hope is that the technology will eliminate the risks that come with fallible human drivers. The idea is that a powerful enough AI can be fed enough data to learn everything that it needs in order to understand the world around it. The death of Elaine Herzberg and the investigation that followed revealed the lie of autonomy. The Uber autonomous vehicle was not as autodidactic nor as independent as Uber wanted us to believe. The technology didn't work, but the company blamed the crash on the safety driver, the woman that was sat behind the wheel and supposed to be in charge of the vehicle when the crash happened. This pattern of blaming the human is fairly typical. Madeleine Ellish has called the human in the loop the moral crumple zone in these sorts of encounters. And it's also worth noting that immediately after the crash, the first person that was blamed for it was, of course, Elaine Herzberg herself for being in the wrong place. Now, all crashes have multiple causes. The crash investigators here revealed how dependent the car was, not just on its sensors and its AI, and the engineers knew at the time of the crash that the AI was not up to the job, but also dependent on a supportive infrastructure, predictable road users behaving as they're supposed to, and a safety driver who in this case had been given very little training. It was also extremely dependent on a benign policy environment provided by the governor of Arizona, who had invited Uber to come and test their cars on the streets of Phoenix and asked almost nothing in return. This crash ended Uber's hopes of winning their imagined race to develop a self-driving car, but it didn't dampen the enthusiasm of others. Obviously, I couldn't get through a moral lecture without a Musk reference. Musk and Tesla, his company, have doubled down on an approach that they say doesn't need any fancy sensors or special roads. It's just about more and more AI. And if you look at the deadlines that he has set himself, it doesn't seem to be working. But that hasn't stopped Tesla from charging its customers thousands of dollars for something that they call full self-driving, which is sold as being just around the corner any day now. Musk's story is not just about robotic autonomy in a technical sense, it's also about human autonomy, your freedom to travel as you wish, wherever you like, and your freedom from regulators who might want to stop you. And it's part of a longer story about emancipatory technologies that promise to free humanity from various burdens. Theory bit, this is quite theory-light, this talk, but here's a little bit. This is the great anthropologist of science, Bruno Latour, who died almost a year ago. Latour said that the developments of technologies involved the realization not of freedom, but of what he called attachments of things and people at an ever-expanding scale and at an ever-increasing degree of intimacy. Here is a moment of intimacy. Two tech bros on a Zoom call, one of them showing his self-driving car to the other. This is Kyle Vogt, the chief executive of a self-driving car company, Cruise, talking to the aforementioned Sam Altman. And it's like two guys playing a video game here. You can see what the car sees, and you can also have this sort of reassuring view, God's eye view of the car's environment, and they're showing the car obviously doing nothing wrong at all. And yet, this sort of thing, while it would have seemed absolutely magical, the idea of a car genuinely driving itself, not around somewhere easy like Phoenix, Arizona, but somewhere complicated like San Francisco, even though this is amazing, and had you shown it to me 10 years ago, I would have assumed that it was a deep fake, although I wouldn't have known what a deep fake was 10 years ago. It might also still be not nearly good enough. And if we look at the reality of Cruise's experiences in San Francisco, we see a rather different story. These vehicles are imposing themselves upon cities in other ways, even if they're not causing major disasters. Most of the mishaps have been minor ones. They are not moving fast and breaking things, but they're definitely moving slowly and clogging a lot of things up. And society is being forced to come to terms with the attachments of self-driving cars after the fact. The companies involved are very secretive, even if the experiment that they're performing looks very public. So a lot of the data collection, the relevant data collection, is happening on social media, the sort of thing that you can see here. There have been lots of reports of robot cars blocking roads, failing to detect construction sites, nudging into buses, getting in the way of emergency services. And there was, in fact, another report yesterday of another crash involving a cruise vehicle. Cruise's PR response has been like an abusive partner to try to make us feel even worse about ourselves. This was a full-page ad they took out in the New York Times in July. More recently than that, some of San Francisco's residents have been even less pleased. The promise here is a technology that will solve our problems, in particular the problem of dangerous human driving, by learning and adapting, and that the rest of the world doesn't need to change. That's the promise. The reality is inevitably that the world does have to adapt. If you are an engineer, the challenge of getting a computer to drive like a person is really compelling, but it's an odd approach. It's odd to get a camera, for example, to look at a traffic light, to detect what colour that traffic light is, when the traffic light could just communicate its status directly to a connected car. But it's also odd, let's face it, to put soft, fleshy, vulnerable pedestrians onto a shared space with heavy lumps of often fast-moving metal. This is an example that, I mean, it's a few years old now, but it shows you the sort of everyday challenges of an open, unconstrained system. In engineering terms, it is far easier to look at a situation like that and find ways to close this system, to reduce the uncertainty and the contingency that might be involved, and you might make a claim that that's good for safety as well as being good for getting a self-driving car to go from place to place. A couple of years ago, I did a set of interviews with self-driving car developers, and in private, they do, most of them, admit all the various ways in which they are trying to, or would like to, reduce the complexity of the system. To give you an example, they're making things like this. This is a 3D LiDAR map with which a self-driving car can anticipate what is likely to be around the next corner in order to make its job easier. But technologies like LiDAR sensors, designed to fix particular problems, also create problems themselves, and the technological fixes need technological fixes. So in this case, this is a LiDAR cleaning device. Back in 1983, the UCL psychologist Lisanne Bainbridge wrote a brilliant paper on what she called the ironies of automation. One of these ironies was that automation doesn't make problems of human labour and human error disappear, and in many cases it adds to the computations. Anybody that's interested in football would have seen the recent controversy over VAR for a lovely example of Bainbridge's ironies of automation in action. Since she published that paper, there have also been some lovely sociological studies of robot vacuum cleaners, technologies that we are all familiar with, like supermarket self-checkouts, where we humans realise the effort that is required to compensate for a technology's limits. Like the Wizard of Oz, self-driving car companies would like us to pay no attention to the man behind the curtain. But even if we can't see anybody in the driving seat of a cruise vehicle, there are plenty of people keeping the show on the road. There are remote controllers, map makers, data labelers, maintenance people, cleaners, software engineers, lobbyists, and much more besides. The companies claim that these people are temporary support staff, much like the people that ChatGPT are currently using to moderate their model in order to make its outputs less toxic, a sort of hidden army of what some have called ghost workers. But if the technology succeeds, we're likely to see a permanent reconfiguring of human labour and infrastructure such that these staff become a permanent fixture. And if self-driving vehicle companies manage to persuade cities that they do more good than harm, we will see pressure to upgrade infrastructure to make our cities more machine-readable. As Harry Van Lente has argued, technological promises can quickly become demands upon society. And there will also be pressure on other road users. One technology developer that we interviewed said their job would be made much easier, quote, if people could agree to cross at zebra crossings. On which point, I should mention that it later emerged that one of the reasons that the self-driving Uber failed when it came to Elaine Herzberg is that the engineers had decided that objects in the road, but not in pedestrian crossings, couldn't be pedestrians. A century ago, particularly in the US, but also here, there were changes to rules and social norms that favoured cars. And this has shaped how we get about, how we live, how we experience risk, and how we build our places ever since. This poster is from a US campaign to shame pedestrians off the road. Jaywalking, the offence of jaywalking, did not exist until the car. And interestingly, there was an attempt to introduce it in Britain that lasted exactly 3 months. Jaywalking as a misdemeanor. The historian Peter Norton has pointed out that rather than rebuild our world around the next new way of getting about, we should think about who is actually going to benefit. Right. Next one, handbrake turn. Next case study. This is personal, this one. So I am an occasional mediocre drummer. And I'm going to explain, well, I'm going to try to escape my solipsistic concerns with drum machines. That's what this is, an exercise. It's an exercise in sort of cheap therapy. I will start with the drummer Clyde Stubblefield. Clyde Stubblefield playing with James Brown. The tune is from 1970. I think this picture is from around about the same time. James Brown at the Newport Jazz Festival, where brilliantly he's on stage with 3 drummers here. Clyde Stubblefield is one of those drummers, and I hope I can play you this. Now, some of you will know what that loop is. I can't tell you're nodding in the sort of... That loop is the drum break from a tune called Funky Drummer. And even if you don't know the tune immediately, I promise you that you will have heard it. It's the most sampled drum break of all time. Don't at me if you're the sort of person that says, no, actually it was the Amen break, we can have that argument later. But the point of that phrase has been looped, sampled, often sped up and used more than 1,000 times in the service of other tunes. If you want to take the funky drummer, this seemed like such a good idea at the time, and as I'm talking to you, it suddenly doesn't seem like a good idea. We can take the 16 semiquavers of the funky drummer and relatively easily automate it. 16 semiquavers is quite easy for a computer to understand and to do the maths on. Each beat fits nicely into a grid, which makes it consistent, and once we program it into a machine, it will not speed up or slow down. So I programmed it into this machine, which is a drum machine that my friend Tom, thank you Tom, gave me. It's a very small drum machine. I didn't want to program this in real time because that wouldn't have worked. So instead I've taken this tiny drum machine, I'll do you a video of my massive hands playing my version of the funky drummer. Which I think we can all agree is missing something. But it's correct, right? That's the version. It's playing the music that that's done there. The point is that most of our time we don't want our music to sound too much like a machine. There's something ineffably human about the way that Clyde Stubblefield plays the funky drummer that makes his loop so popular, much more popular than a mechanical one would be. But the history of drum machines suggests that there are plenty of people who think that it is both easy and desirable to automate drummers. The history of drum machines is very, very long indeed. But I will go through it very, very quickly, so don't worry, because I'm not a historian. But I will start with the brilliantly titled Book of Knowledge of Ingenious Mechanical Devices, published in 1206. Ismail al-Jazari describes a mechanical boat powered by water, which would have been a toy to entertain royal guests. And on the deck of the boat is a model band whose drummers play patterns that are set by adjustable pegs inside the boat's guts. The roboticist Noel Sharkey, who recreated this thing for a TV program a few years ago, claims that this drum machine counts as one of the first programmable robots. But it doesn't really count as a drum machine, so to find a drum machine that really threatens the livelihood of a practicing drummer, we should probably fast forward to the 1950s. This is a Wurlitzer Sideman. The Wurlitzer Sideman was first sold in 1959, and you can see that this thing works by dragging an arm across electrical contacts up the top right. That's the sort of outer cover of the thing that looks like a small wardrobe has been removed there, and you can hear an action. And you can see that there are 48 rows of contacts there, which 48 is neatly divisible into 4s and 3s, so that you can do you a samba, a shuffle, a waltz, a tango, and you can vary the tempo by increasing or decreasing the speed of that spinning arm. The advert for this thing is very clear on its job-stealing intentions. It promises a full rhythm section at your side for the jobbing organist that you can see there, who is now able, he's very happy because he's just fired his drummer. Despite how the thing sounds, the rather odd sound of the machine, it spooked the British Musicians' Union at the time, who dismissed it as, quotes, a stilted and unimaginative performer. The union's reaction to the Sideman follows in a long line of musicians' concerns about musical innovation. Over the last 300 years, musicians have complained loudly about the piano, the mechanical flute, the metronome, the player piano, and most recently, probably auto-tune. John Philip Sousa, who was the most popular musician of his day, wrote an essay in 1906 on what he rather brilliantly called the menace of mechanical music. He was referring to the mediation of the relationship between performer and audience with the arrival of the phonograph, which he called, quote, a substitute for human skill, intelligence, and soul. And he admitted that his interests were mostly economic ones. He was making huge amounts of money from touring his band and selling sheet music. But he also claimed that innovation was tearing the soul out of what he considered real music to be. And he had a point. Technologies don't just solve problems, they change our expectations and they change our sense of what's normal. If we look at auto-tune, auto-tune corrects a singer's pitch, but it also changes how we expect music to sound. Okay, back to the drum machine, and we're now in the 1980s. This is Roger Lynn, drum machine pioneer. From the 1980s onwards, Roger Lynn's drum machines gave musicians for the first time sounds that sounded like real drums, sampled from real drums. When Lynn was creating his first drum machines, computer memory was expensive, so when clumsy humans would finger drum their beats into the machines would round each beat up or down to the nearest one. On this drum machine, it's called error correction. You can just see down the bottom left the error correct button that allows you to round up by quavers or semi-quavers, except that Americans call them 8th notes and 16th notes because they don't understand. So this was error correction was sold as a solution to imperfect human timekeeping. But as Roger Lynn got access to more memory, he realized that he could do something else. He could give programmers more control by allowing not just more precise error correction, but by shifting beats in ways that Lynn thought would feel more human, to move them off-grid a little bit. This was sometimes called swing. On this drum machine, it's the variation between straight and shuffle that allows you to vary the gaps between the notes, but it's the same thing. And I'm going to demonstrate, and again, this seemed like a good idea at the time, with my own little drum machine. Here's one that I made earlier. This is me demonstrating swinging the funky drummer with my massive hands. This is the regular straight beat. And if you turn up the swing, it sounds a little bit, those of you who remember the 90s might call this New Jack swing. And then you can dial it back down again, so there's just a sort of hint of swing. So it feels just a little bit off, but still sounds sort of recognisably straight. That's quite enough of that. Now, Stubblefield's playing does actually have a swing to it that comes from his accumulated expertise as a drummer. A big part of a drummer's knowledge is tacit, it's impossible to put in words, and it's embodied. Clyde Stubblefield's notes come from the dance of his limbs. Musicologists have studied the funky drummer break in part to understand why it is so popular, and found that his semiquavers have a swing ratio of 1.1 to 1. So they're not quite straight, not quite even, where 1 to 1 would be perfectly straight and 2 to 1 would be something that sounds like a shuffle, musicians in the audience. They also found incidentally that his backbeats, the snare on the 2 and 4 are slightly later than you would expect them to be, which gives it a sort of relaxed feel. All of it, even saying this, especially to musicians in the audience, is a little bit heretical, because swing is one of those things that is seen as sort of indescribably human. Fats Waller was once asked to define it and said, if you've got to ask, you ain't got it. Along come the musicologists and try not just to define it, but to put it into maths. And in jazz, swing comes from experience, wisdom, the body, and also the interaction with others in the moment, all of which makes it possible to replicate after the fact, but hard to automate in real time. Now, the technophile view is that these technologies don't substitute for humans, but they allow humans to understand new things about music and go to new musical places. Drum machines and other electronic instruments have been used in ways far outside their designers' intentions. Asking what is better, a drum machine or a drummer, is to miss the point. They are different and they do different things. The most innovative musicians, from Stravinsky to Stevie Wonder, saw music technologies not as a solution to a problem, but as a new set of possibilities. And this innovation changes our sense of what a drummer is and what drums can be. According to this book by Dan Charnas, so this book came out I think towards the end of last year, the 21st century's most important drummer was not a drummer at all, but was a producer. Jay Diller's instrument was an MPC sampler, this thing in the top right, also invented by Roger Lynn, which could grab bits of sound, chop them up, bend them, and assemble them in new ways. The sampler allowed its programmers to fit into a grid, or to go off-grid, or to allow different amounts of swing to different sounds. And according to Charnas, Diller's disorientating experiments with swing, which are exceptionally hard to replicate on a drum kit because they're so counterintuitive, have not just created a new musical aesthetic, but also changed our collective sense of rhythm. Have we got time for some music? I think we've just got time for it. I'll just play you a little hint, just to give you a sense of what I mean, even if most of you say, whatever, this is a university without a music department. I think it's important occasionally to listen to some music in a lecture. This tune is from Brandy, 2002. The tune's called What About Us? And even though it wasn't produced by Jay Diller, it is, according to Charnas, an early example of his influence in action. Geeks, listen out for the rhythm and see if you can work out. What I'm asking you to do here is to understand how the producer is deliberately messing with metronomic time. So things, the beats are not where your brain naturally expects them to be. And now you can hear this sort of thing everywhere. This sort of groove, which you wouldn't have heard in the 1990s, has become possible thanks to data and samplers and all the rest of it. Sorry, Brandy, we're going to stop you there. Now, the obvious and mean response to all of this is that drumming doesn't actually require much intelligence, human or artificial. We could actually say also that driving doesn't require that much intelligence either. But when we see something being automated, it prompts the question of what we think is special about that thing and what might be lost as new technologies give us new capabilities. Musicians, despite their hard-won skills, can't be complacent. If you're a drummer, maybe the algorithm is indeed going to get you. This was actually the thing that initially freaked me out, that was shown to me by my son, who is trying to hide it back there. This is the drummer feature from Apple's GarageBand app. And here, what you can do as you're composing your track is go into the app and find a drummer to accompany you. And the instructions say that each genre comes with a number of drummers who have their own drum kit, percussion instruments, and distinct playing style. Kyle, or Logan, or Curtis, or Quincy, or Finn can all be adjusted for complexity. They can dial up or down their fills. You can tweak them, you can give them more or less swing. These algorithms, with their distinct personalities, won't just give you an infinite variety of beats based on their combined data set of all drumming ever. They will also listen to the other parts of your music and respond. They're not just mimicking a drummer's sounds, they're also promising to improve upon the musical choices that a drummer might make. But despite the temptation, musicians shouldn't take this sort of thing too personally, if that's possible. If we focus too much on preserving some sort of human essence, we might miss the bigger story, which is a sort of economic and cultural land grab. I think we should be interested and worried about a massive fall, for example, in the cost of producing stuff that sounds like music, just as we should be worried about the massive collapse in the cost of producing stuff that looks like text. Spotify now has substantial amounts of music that is generated by AI, much of it labeled functional music, designed not to be listened to, but to just have on. Sousa, I'm sure, is turning in his grave. And some of this music is being sorted by AI, and some of it indeed is being listened to by bots in order to boost its ratings on Spotify. So, where does that leave us? I'm not at all sure. I thought when I put together these two case studies it would be fun to talk about both, and as I find myself talking about both, I realised they have almost nothing in common. But if I can try to recover some sense of a message out of this, it would be to try to put the abstract idea of artificial intelligence in its place by looking at the playing out of new technologies in the real world. I think driving and drumming are both interactive, they're both conversational, which means that they can't simply be automated, and the process of automation necessarily changes other social relationships around them. So, to come back to the question of the politics of technology, who benefits and who decides about such things? And can policymakers anticipate these things and intervene before a technology becomes a fact of life that proves hard to shift? For the last 50 years or so, sociologists of technology have been studying how technological artifacts have built-in politics, but technologies are still often seen, including by our government, as neutral tools that can be used for good or bad purposes. which means that the politics underlying them is often disguised as mere progress. When it comes to new technologies, it's hard to anticipate who the winners and losers are going to be in advance. It's tempting to try and predict what the real game is behind self-driving vehicles, to imagine that the conspiracy might be one of surveillance or selling advertising to captive passengers. But actually, the mode of innovation is much more speculative. The aim might be to scale for scale's sake. I think the history of drum machines shows us something interesting about the politics of technology. The question of who wins and loses from drum machines is a tricky one. On one hand, the technology seems to have shifted power from drummers to producers, but it's also handed the means of music production to kids with laptops. And drummers never had much power anyway. Poor Clyde Stubblefield didn't just play the funky drummer loop, he also composed it, but he saw a negligible share of the success that it would go on to have. He was just paid a session fee at the time. We should remember that musicians were at the sharp end of the gig economy long before it was called that. For self-driving cars, we can see some of the problems with the current direction of travel. If the technology is seen as just a substitute for a regular singular occupancy vehicle, there might be some safety benefits, but problems of car use, car dependency, and the traffic and eventually urban sprawl that comes with it could get worse. The technology at the moment risks following the money, giving people who already have plenty of transport options one more. With self-driving cars, their startups may be stuck in their own story of artificial intelligence. In trying to do something amazing and disruptive, they may end up not being disruptive enough because they're failing to acknowledge all the other things required to make the technology work. If more people are going to benefit from self-driving cars, they'll need to work in places that currently don't have very good transport options, where the current infrastructure may not suit the technology at all, and they're probably going to need to be shared, in which case you're looking at a self-driving bus rather than a self-driving car. And before long you have a model of public transport that might be rather boring in AI terms, but as a social innovation looks far more innovative. So I think the optimistic story is that the politics of technologies in real time are actually more open-ended with the potential for new directions. I think it is possible to say some things about an emerging ideology of AI, and we can see a tendency towards what Shoshana Zuboff calls surveillance capitalism, and we can see a disregard for ownership and copyright in the data that currently feed the machines. We can also see a presumption that bigger is better, which is used to justify a concentration of both computing and economic power. But like any ideology, this should be discussed and challenged. We shouldn't regard it as inevitable. So let me end with 4 messages that I hope will allow for a bit more democracy in the politics of artificial intelligence. First, don't believe the hype. We shouldn't accept the story that AI is taking over. Drum machines don't just replace drummers. Self-driving cars don't just substitute for cars, nor do we want them to. If we see this as a battle between humans and robots, we miss all the ways that tech companies will be looking to quietly reconfigure the world. Hype isn't just exuberance or overexcitement. Hype is deliberate misdirection, and the odd stuff, all the odd stuff about the world ending is all part of the same story. We need to be looking behind the curtain to see where actual choices are being made. Second, don't ask if it's intelligent, ask if it's useful. Standards for AI are still inspired by the Turing test question, is it intelligent? Which is fun, an interesting thought experiment, but socially useless. Instead, we need to ask things like, is it useful, is it safe, for who, and that sort of thing. Third, we shouldn't just wait and see what AI does. We should also consider why it's being developed and how it works, where the data is coming from, and whether its effects are transparent and explainable. At the moment, the British government approach is to let regulators catch AI applications in particular domains. The price of that regulatory freedom is a need for serious vigilance, but there hasn't so far been much sign of that, which means that we could be building up to some very nasty surprises. Fourth, we need to include other people. The noise about AI is currently drowning out the concerns and knowledge of a whole range of other people. The agenda for the government's AI summit is currently being set by a rather small clique, and one reason they've come up with such a narrow focus is that they're ignoring the people who might actually be at risk from AI. If we broaden the range of people involved, we'll also be able to realise new opportunities. the sorts of applications that might be transformative for some people, but might not be very interesting to people currently in Silicon Valley. And finally, we need to make sure that if the technology is a form of social experiment, the learning from that experiment isn't all machine learning. There needs to be some social learning, but this requires openness. We should be demanding more from AI companies. At a first step, we should demand that people testing self-driving cars share their data so that society can start to balance the risks and benefits, and that other companies can make their technologies safer too. And we also need independent, critical science. At the moment, AI research requires enormous resources, so it's almost all done within companies. And for a combination of political and technical reasons, it's hard to get inside AI's black boxes. This needs to change. The physicist Harvey Brooks had a nice phrase that I repeat often. He said that science should be the conscience of technology. And if universities don't do this job, I worry that nobody else will. And with that, I will end. Thank you very much. Questions, or ask me to program various things into my drum machine, which I'm happy to do. Yeah.
I have a question about policies. Is there a single important policy we can really implement in the event that maybe isn't on the agenda right now, it's not being discussed, but it should be?
Good question. So, in policy terms, without trying to get too deep into the sort of policy wonkishness of artificial intelligence regulation, there is currently a sort of battle between the American way of thinking about things and the European Commission way of thinking about things. The European Commission have said that we should assess AI in terms of how big we think the risks are from various applications, and that in high-risk scenarios, we should be able to intervene and even ban some technologies. So they have this sort of risk-based approach that is sort of proactive. So I would say, the UK is currently the government are trying to, as with lots of things right now, position themselves between Europe and the US. But if we want to avoid some nasty surprises, which are unknown unknowns, so I can't say what those surprises are going to be, we do need a bit more of that sort of that proactive sort of approach. We do need to think about what are the cross-cutting ways that we might regulate AI to be able to understand how it works, why it's being developed, whose interests are being represented. But the answer, be more Europe, is not a great argument to be throwing across right now. Let's go.
Thank you very much for the lovely presentation. I have two questions. One, how do you see the impact of AI on increasing economic inequality across the globe? And where can the global conversation move in that direction? And second, where there is undercapacity and technology can play a role in, let's say, decision making in areas like judiciary also, how do you balance the need versus the risk?
Yeah. So, great question, but I think the global inequality question is really interesting. So if you were to talk to somebody in Silicon Valley about global inequalities and the potential of AI to help there, I think they would say something along the lines of, because AI technology spread across an infrastructure that is already pretty well developed across most of the world, the benefits of AI can therefore be spread relatively quickly to a massive number of people. Right? So they might tell a story about the speed with which the benefits of AI might trickle down. And I can sort of tell that you don't buy that story, which is right. Right? So I think if we're serious about economic inequalities, we should start off by saying, well, who tends to benefit from technological change? And the trend is that people already best off benefit, and the people already worst off tend to receive more than their fair share of the harms. That's both within countries and between countries. If we want to change that, it requires policy action. Right? And we can think about technologies that do tend to buck that trend, and they tend to be technologies like vaccines, whose benefits are socialized in some ways. With AI, I think there's an additional point that takes you into a slightly older debate about economic and technological dependence, which is that currently the actors in control of AI, controlling the economic and the social capital around AI, are based in a very small part of the world. Right? They're almost all in the US, some in China, are trying to compete. So one of the things that we would be concerned about is whether, for, say, the global south to benefit from the technology, they also need to have a say in driving the technology, in controlling it. Otherwise, it might exacerbate their dependency upon infrastructures and technologies that are being delivered from the global north. Now, your second question about particular areas where there might be huge benefits. I mean, I completely agree that there are potential benefits across a range of areas if the technology is managed well. So most of the stories about how AI is being used in the judiciary, we hear scare stories about how it reinforces bias through its rather thoughtless application, how it offers to solve problems of fallible human judges who get tired after lunch and that sort of stuff. I think anybody interested in AI and its benefits should be asking not what are the benefits, but how would we go about ensuring and demonstrating those benefits while mitigating those risks. And we have ways of thinking about technologies in other domains, which means that we don't just take the claims of the people developing the technologies for granted. And the obvious one is when we have new pharmaceuticals, we don't just say, yep, sounds great, give it to everyone. Right? We run clinical trials that are independent of the people developing the technology in order to evaluate that technology in particular domains. Now, that would require substantial amounts of resource. It would also require the people developing AI to let go of some of the control of the technology in order to evaluate claims in particular areas. But I hope that we will see exactly that sort of thing. I think that's part of the sort of critical science point that I ended on, was the need to have that sort of independent evaluation of some of these technologies rather than just taking Sam Altman's word for it. Now, let's go. Yes.
Hi, thank you for that talk, Jack. So you talked about the importance of not believing the hype, but obviously this hype is kind of supported by really very powerful kind of corporate imaginaries with a lot of resources behind them, and these very compelling, seductive sort of visions of the future. So I guess I wondered where you thought the most sort of powerful or compelling kind of counter visions or counter imaginaries lie, and what kinds of work can be done to support and disseminate them?
Yes. You're encouraging me to be more optimistic than I feel right now. Yes, if we take seriously that hype isn't just a problem, that it's a sort of powerful force that needs to be counterbalanced, or at least held to account in some way, what might the alternatives look like? I mean, I think part of combating that is to requires the enrollment of a bunch of people who at the moment might not see their agency in this discussion. So, normally we would say we would want civil society, for example, to act as a really important counterbalance to some of the claims being made about private sector AI. We would want university research to be a really important counterbalance. In a lot of cases, the tendency is to sort of wait and see. So there has been some really important work that looks at how relatively simple algorithms have already been deployed and used in problematic ways, and evaluating those and saying, this isn't what you think it is, right? Which is really, really important work, but it's not the same work as having that discussion sort of upstream and saying, how can we actually counter the hype while the hype is the thing that's doing the work? Because it's quite clear that the hype is doing the work long before the technology is actually being made real. I don't know what that looks like. I would have some sort of faith in things like critical journalism, and I think there is some great investigative reporting about artificial intelligence that does actually go upstream and ask questions about why these things are being developed in the way that they're being developed, and doesn't just, buy and then echo the story of inevitability that comes. But, for an industry that's X billion dollars, that might be a rather feeble counterbalance. So, I don't know.
Maybe related, also this is kind of just drifting, if you will, not really a question, but I think a through line between your case studies is the theme of the attempt to reduce friction and the inevitable failure. The kind of the ways that driving and the road are sort of reduced and regulated and ignored by self-driving car companies, and people with their own agency coming in literally smashing cars, or in some cases Silicon Valley people just stand in front of self-driving cars as exist. And then the connection to artists like Dilla, or early hip-hop artists and electronic artists who took technology to create new genres in a way outside of the music industry at large, which then fed in and was appropriated and commercialized. But that's a through line, and maybe that also serves to be another imaginary of can we outside of corporations create new things with the technology.
That's really nice. Yes, it makes me think of the sort of rule-breaking, rule-following aspect of this that you mentioned, right? And in particular, so the example, if you don't spend as much time watching self-driving car videos as I do, the example that Jackie mentioned is that there are people in San Francisco, including a small organised group, who have been hacking Cruise's technologies through the simple act of putting traffic cones on their bonnets, which means that the self-driving cars can't go anywhere, which we could argue makes them even more annoying for a city that wants to go on its way. But there is something really interesting about the rules of the road, that even though we tell ourselves this story about driving, we tell ourselves that it's freedom and the open road and that we can go wherever we like, we are more regulated when we drive than probably in any other aspect of our lives. And part of what the self-driving car companies are trying to do is to say that those rules, or not all of those rules, apply to us. And the process of innovation is a process of constructive rule breaking. The connection you drew to, I guess, musical innovation is quite an interesting one, and makes me think about the potential for creativity. If we regard some form of rule breaking as an interesting, innovative exercise within reason, do we think that's possible with AI technologies in the same way as it has been with music technology? Do we think that we will see innovative people from the bottom up being able to hack and repurpose and take technology in new directions and take culture in new directions? And that's, I guess, what I'm sort of worried about, that you've made me see it much more clearly. So thank you. Who else have we got? Yeah, in the corner there.
Well, thinking about AI in self-driving cars, healthcare, any virus area, I feel like we decidedly hold it to a lot higher standards in terms of risk mitigation and safety than we would with human actors. And I wonder, assuming it's largely due to the attribution issue or responsibility issue, and I'm wondering if you believe that if we were to find ways to regulate the issue of responsibility or attribution, if something was wrong, if AI would be more readily accepted, or if you think that there's other reasons why we might want to hold AI to higher standards than human actors.
Yes. So it's a really interesting question. A question about, do we and should we hold AI to the same standard, a higher standard? I would say you know, a couple of things. The first thing is, where would we get the evidence in order to make that risk calculation? And then how would we balance that calculation against a benefit calculation, right? Which is something that a clinical trial would do in the case of a new medicine. I actually, about a year ago, was part of a report for the government on, in effect, the question of how safe is safe enough for a self-driving car, which the government, bless them, almost immediately ignored, right? They came up with a statement that said that a self-driving car, the standard that we should expect is that it should be safer than the safest human driver. Our recommendation was that given the uncertainties about being able to evaluate why a self-driving car does what it does, plus all of the politics around what would happen if, say, a self-driving car ran over a child and a transport secretary had to explain to the mother of that child how, in effect, their child was sacrificed for the greater good, right? And this is the sort of brutal reality of the way that we think about risk, that we might sort of think about the acceptable levels of risk from a self-driving car much like the acceptable levels of risk from a train or a plane, in which case we want it to be probably 100 times safer on average. Right? We still have very, very few cases on which to start to make a calculation, on which even to draw qualitative conclusions about what a self-driving car death means. But one thing I think we can say with confidence, that the presumption that we should apply the same standards to AI as we do to humans and draw a sort of equivalence is quite easy to dissolve. Right? So I don't think we should presume that it will be okay to just say, oh, don't worry, humans are bad too. Yeah? If we want to, if we're serious about having that conversation in the future, we need to think about what data we need to collect now in order to say, well, how safe are these things? You know, how much do we know about the risks of self-driving cars or the dangers of what gets missed in a AI system that's looking at mammograms or whatever the domain is. Here.
Jack, thanks. It's a remarkable, you've come to a remarkable conclusion here in some ways. And you've said, from what I can see, we need better evidence of the impacts of technologies, and we need to look at methods, methodologies, processes like, say, randomized controlled trials. So I want to ask you, going back to your demos days, where has the field of science policy, science and technology come to that things like randomized controlled trials that many of us have been critiquing because of where they sit in a hierarchy of knowledge, the voices they exclude along the way, that these now are the methods to hold into account even more powerful stakeholders, actors in society. So have we run out of ammo?
Have we run out of ammo? So again, there's a sort of a optimism, pessimism invitation behind your question. And I don't know whether I'm more or less optimistic over the last sort of 20 years in terms of how we think about emerging technologies and their governance. I worry that a sense of economic desperation and over the last 20 years, stagnation in productivity, for example, has led to a more dependence on speculative technologies and less willingness to ask difficult questions. I don't think I would think that something like the randomized controlled trial would be a satisfying answer to all of those questions. But I think just to engage with, what would it even take to entertain the possibility of running a randomized controlled trial, even in the uses of AI in medicine. Randomized controlled trials have been really, really rare, and there have been a few people calling for them. And then once you have those sorts of measures, even the idea of somebody external asking difficult questions of a speculative new technology is a pretty radical proposal at the moment. Now, I think in years to come, I would hope, if you institutionalise some form of that sort of test, that you would then have people like us asking difficult questions about the adequacy of those tests as well. But I don't like the suggestion that you think that I've gone negative. Tom.
Thank you for your lecture. I was struck that in both your big case studies, there was something that was lost when I acknowledge the organist kind of loses the capacity to form a friendship with a real drummer who might drive him to hospital. His sideman is not going to do that. And the passenger in the driverless cab loses the opportunity to have a conversation that changes their mind. To what extent, when you consider the acceleration of automation, do you worry about loneliness, social fragmentation, and the rise of individualism?
I mean, I do now. It's made me all sad. I think it's one of these. So again, if I'm trying to channel a sort of Silicon Valley tech response to that, it would be to say, yeah, sure, but we can make all of these sorts of interactions more efficient, and in most cases, an interaction with a taxi driver is not that rewarding. And drummers are annoying, you have to pay them, and they play too loudly and they speed up, etc., right? So the tech bros would assume that the automation solves the problem, and that the efficiency gains would be weighed against, all the rest of it. They would also assume that once you solve that problem and live your life more efficiently, you can also do the things that you want to do more. So you'll get home quicker, or you can speak to the people that you want to talk to while you're in the back of the cab, rather than an annoying driver. Right? So they would say that this is about maximizing your freedom. But one of the things that you're pointing to is, it's a bit sort of littorial, right? It's about saying that there are human relationships in all of this, and to deny them is to not only realise what you're losing, but also to deny all of the human beings that are actually there. There aren't human beings inside the words a sideman, like a sort of mechanical turd, but there are human beings working, doing boring jobs, not being able to have conversations behind the scenes at cruise. Right? The office workers that are supporting the apparently driverless cars. I think I'm with you. The question is how we can think about those questions of loneliness and attachment in a way that may be persuasive to the people in Silicon Valley, rather than just saying, that sort of thing always happens, and technology enables you to do the stuff that you want to do. How are we doing for time? We should probably maybe take a couple more.
Hi. You answered a question earlier about different approaches from the US and EU as it relates to regulation and risk levels. I'm wondering about how you think about China as it relates to how the government is approaching their kind of approach to big tech companies within China, how it relates to kind of society at large and how they consider that, as well as to the most kind of economically disadvantaged, and what kind of differences are.
Yeah. I confess, I'm afraid I don't know much about China's government's approach to artificial intelligence. I think what we can see so far is a sort of clear tension between a dependence on technology for economic renewal, and again, the Chinese economy stagnating means that desperation is probably dialed up a little bit. The tension between that economic imperative and, in China's case, a real concern about the social and cultural effects of that sort of disruption. So one of the concerns that has certainly moved across to Western discussions is a concern that China has with the fact that the outputs of generative AI systems will not necessarily be a good fit with what the Communist Party would like us to say, right? So the problems of misinformation and systems of censorship currently built into Chinese governments might be torn apart by these sorts of things. So there are those sorts of concerns that have led to a sort of dialectic. Some who want to crack down on tech companies and presume that tech companies will lead to an inevitable process of westernization, and others that would say no, tech companies are our future. But beyond just observing that tension, I'm not sure I can say much more.
So first of all, thank you for this awesome event here. And I got two questions. First, actually it's like a little bit add up to that lady's question I did. So the hype is not only in the West, but also in the East. Like Elon Musk and Tesla, very famous in China. They got the biggest car factories out there, actually factories in the future. And I'm 100% sure that there are some car factories that are going to or are doing some research on the driverless car in Japan. So there must some scientists share this kind of concern with you. So might be a little bit optimistic, but do you think is there like any kind of necessary to strengthen more talk between the Western scientists and the Eastern scientists? I mean, more international cooperation to share this kind of concern and make sure that this kind of voice is big enough to express to the government across the globe? And that's the first question. And the second question is, there's an opinion that really, very popular in Chinese social media, I'm not sure it's shared in the Western, is that initially we're researching artificial intelligence as to help us to release some burden of humanity, like trying to let us to release from the hard work in the society. And we can choose to do some like probably artwork, have more freedom to do things we want to do. But turns out the position has swapped. Our AI, they are trying to do more artworks, do more things they want to do, and we're still stuck in this kind of societal stuff. So what's your opinion on this trend?
Good, right. Thanks. So on the first point, right, what are we, I think it's a really interesting question, so we might reframe it as a sort of question of science diplomacy. Given the dynamic of this sort of innovation is often an imagined race, not just between companies, but between countries, right? And certainly you hear Chinese policymakers talking about self-driving cars, and they would like their companies to be the first ones to develop a self-driving car, whatever that means in a particular place. And there's been a lot of testing of self-driving cars in Chinese cities. That race sort of language is pretty toxic for any discussion that you want to have about governance, because it is easy for the companies involved to present that as a race to the bottom, right? The fewer regulations we have, the quicker we will be able to get to whatever the imagined finish line is. I think there is, though, that your question hints at something quite interesting, which is that collaboration, and scientific collaboration in particular, may be a way to break through that sort of narrative. Right? The ultimate expression of that sort of race, the innovative race, is an arms race. Right? Which typically an arms race which might take place in secret or with very little knowledge of what the other side is doing. If I were to call another reason for optimism, it might be that at least some of the experimentation here is taking place in public. And so we are able to say, what the various contingencies of the technology as revealed are in these various places, and that maybe a role for researchers is to help that dialogue to take place, which might mean that rather than a race to the bottom, we have the emergence of global standards, which would be maybe an improvement. And then your second point was about the way that you present the artificial intelligence debate, which I think is right in terms of relieving humans of their various burdens, which suits this idea of AI as substituting for human activity in some way. Right? I think there is the potential for a new view of AI that starts instead with the question of what it would what it would look like to complement rather than substitute human labour. And maybe drum machines takes us some way towards that sort of example. But that would require a very different story, right? A different story about, rather than trying to relieve humans, that we're trying to, recognise the various attachments that technologies inevitably have and improve their lot in some way. So I think it would take quite a lot to change that story. But maybe that story will change as, the companies involved make mistakes and governments realise the choices available to them. Things like that. One more, right at the back.
Yeah, so thank you for the talk, it's very fascinating. I do have a question about your time scale for being able to sort of be responsible about this before it not necessarily takes over in some general sense, but changes society fundamentally. So obviously you brought up the example of driverless cars, but there are also many other examples where there's been much faster progress than people have thought, even especially developers things like large language models like ChatGPT. So what do you think about the idea that the sort of race between the different tech companies to sort of bring this product to market with relatively little testing, considering the amount of its capabilities and different capabilities, that would be precisely the thing that would kind of make the time scale a lot shorter than 5 years.
Yeah. So I guess the sociologist's answer would be to wonder what counts as progress here. So one way that we can take OpenAI's claims about ChatGPT becoming the fastest growing app in history. It was something like 100 million users in a couple of months or something. But then we can ask, well, what does that mean in terms of progress? Does that mean just people were playing with stuff? Or does it mean, people making, using this technology in a sort of meaningful way? Does it mean something like social progress? Does it mean something else, right? And it's a really hard thing to pin down exactly, what we might mean by progress here. But I know that we shouldn't take technology companies' word for it. Sorry,
I was going to say what I meant by progress specifically was the actual capabilities of these.
Right. So in that case, I would say, how do we know? Right. So the actual capability, we can look at the capabilities being demonstrated by the people demonstrating the technology, but that's not necessarily the important thing in terms of society making an assessment of whether that progress is in the right direction or at what speed that progress is. Right? I think there's a sort of magic trick aspect to this, where we can be amazed at what's going on and amazed at what seem like novel functionalities, but that's a rather different thing from saying this is what progress looks like. Because according to lots of other measures, you can think about progress currently and you can say, actually, as the Lorax once put it, progress doesn't seem to be progressing too fast. I'm sorry we've run out of time, everybody. Thank you very, very much.